on sale down in the corner, so don't forget to pick one up. In a moment, I'll hand you over to Ian Black, who is The Guardian's Middle East editor, and will be chairing tonight's conversation. Before I do that, if I can just quickly ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for this microphone, which I'll be bringing, because we are live streaming tonight's event. So over to Ian.
Thank you, Millicent. Hi, good evening, and welcome to the Frontline Club, where we're going to hear from Emma Sky about her new book, The Unravelling. If you've been in London this week and you've turned on the radio or been to any events, you may well have already encountered it. It's had a huge amount of, and it's a very, very interesting book. It's been published here, I think, this week, and a month ago in the US, although with only one L in the title, proving the old point about two countries separated by a common language. I was thinking about how to introduce this session briefly. Maybe just a thought about how we're going to do this. There's a standard sort of Frontline Club sort of template. So Emma and I are going to talk, hopefully reasonably amicably, for about 40 minutes. If we run out of things to say, then we will a little earlier go to you, the audience, who are obviously the most important part of this event. So you can ask questions and talk and interact. And I know Emma tells me that some of her friends, good friends from Iraqi days, are here as well, and we'll particularly be hoping to hear from them, so that we have a lively discussion about the past, about the present, and maybe a little bit about the future too, because of course it's hard to separate things out. I think you're not wanting just to look back. I was struck by a headline in one paper that I saw. I think it was something like Petite Brit Peacenik who tamed America's Genghis Khan. Is that an accurate description of what your book's about?
I don't think I'm petite. I think I'm average height for Europe.
Okay, well that's the easy bit. But what about taming American Genghis Khan? Because maybe a more difficult question to answer.
Well, my old boss in Iraq, General Odeano, was a very, very large human being, so 6'6", colossal. When I first saw him, I had never seen such a large person. I thought he was a different species. He's just huge. And my nickname for him was Genghis Khan. He had quite a reputation after his first tour as being somebody who sort of knocked down doors, very tough guy. But he was somebody who learned and changed during the Iraq War, like many of us. I think many of us came with some preconceptions, and I think the story of the war is how much we learned and changed.
Because you yourself, very interesting, so quite a lot of, inevitably in your book, autobiography and reflection about yourself and your own feelings. You describe yourself as somebody who was opposed to the war of 2003, even volunteered, I think, to be a human shield. Somebody said you were a Guardian reader as well, which I found slightly shocking, but nevertheless kind of, pins you, doesn't it, category. And yet you found yourself working for the US military in what I think most people would still agree was a very controversial war. How did you yourself come to terms?
Well, the British government back in 2003 asked for volunteers to go out to Iraq for 3 months to administer the country before we handed it back to the Iraqis. So I thought, here's my opportunity to go out to Iraq to apologize for the war. I'd spent working in Israel-Palestine. I'd got skills in institutional development, in mediation, and I thought, I'm going to go apologize and help them rebuild their country. It was only supposed to be for 3 months. Now, before I left, I hadn't been told what my job was going to be. The only instructions I'd received from the Foreign Office was a phone call that said, get to RAF Brize Norton, jump on a plane, fly to Basra, and you'll be met there by someone holding a sign with your name on it and taken to the nearest hotel.
Like a kind of minicab at the airport sort of thing?
Yeah. So that was the only briefing that I had. So I thought, a job for me to do, they just hadn't yet told me what that job was going to be. So when I arrived in Basra, there was nobody to meet me, nobody expecting me. So I went up to Baghdad, found my way to the palace, and at the palace, I spent about a week there. That was the headquarters of the coalition. They said, we've got enough people here, try Mosul. So got on a plane, went off to Mosul, And in Mosul, they said, oh, we've got somebody here, keep going. So I got to Erbil in Kurdistan, and they said, you know, we don't need anybody else here, try Kirkuk. So I got to Kirkuk, and when I arrived, they said, oh, great. You are now the government coordinator of the province. You, it's like being a colonial administrator. You report to Ambassador Bremer, he's the head of the coalition, and good luck.
But I mean, you know, given your own political views, at least before, with all the, you know, the run up to the war, we all remember 9/11, Bush, and the 45-minute warning, and the search for weapons of mass destruction that, of course, never materialized. What? I mean, and I understand that you wanted to, you, as you put it, you almost wanted to make amends, to apologize. But were you concerned about being, actually, you know, being a Brit associated with the war in those circumstances? Or did you think, actually, despite your initial opposition to it, that maybe it had turned out at the beginning? I'm just curious about your feelings, given your background and given the, you know, you end up in Kirkuk.
So when I arrived in Kirkuk, ready to apologize to everybody for the war, people said to me, didn't you know what it was like to live under Saddam? Don't you know that that man mass murdered people? We'd lived under him, we'd lived under sanctions, we'd gone into great poverty. They said, we're not here, you know, we don't want to listen to your apologies, we want your help to rebuild our country. They had hopes that we could turn it into Dubai within 6 months. They had great hopes.
So actually your meeting with Iraqi reality gave you a deeper understanding perhaps than many of the people who had opposed the war, including yourself maybe in the first place, that there was that getting rid of Saddam actually was maybe quite a good idea.
From the perspective of the Iraqi people, he was a mass murderer, and they had suffered for decades under him. They associated the West with supporting Saddam. Mm-hmm. So they saw this was the guy who we'd sold weapons to, that then they accused the West of starving them through sanctions. So the fact that we'd brought an end to the war and hopefully sanctions, people were optimistic about a better future.
So high hopes at the beginning. There's a very riveting section in the book. I don't know whether you want to read from it or perhaps just I'll mention it, and hopefully people will buy the book, of course, afterwards. But there's a riveting section not long after you arrive in Kirkuk, I think, that you come under attack with RPGs whizzing through your pajamas and stuff like that, well, without you in them, happily. But obviously a dangerous and violent introduction, and a very chaotic one as well. There's a lovely bit, where you describe meeting John Sawers, who was then the British ambassador or representative. He was the British ambassador, wasn't he, I think? Yeah. And you say, well, any idea what I should be doing? And he says something like, well, get to know the Turkmen, he says, which I thought was a great line, you know, straight out of a sort of imperial history book. But you encountered not only chaos, but physical danger as well. That must have been disconcerting at the very least, wasn't it?
Well, this was all in my first week. So I'd been put in charge of a province, which I hadn't expected. Mm. Then, in my first week, insurgents came to the front door of the house in which I was living, in downtown Kirkuk, and with their RPGs, with their rockets, they attacked the house. So 5 rockets, of which one went up through the ceiling into the room where I was sleeping. But it was a sturdy house, thank goodness. So the concrete took out a lot of the explosion before it came up. But that made me realize that, well, I had to find somewhere else to live. That was number one. So I went to find who was in charge, who was the military guy in charge of the province. In the Kirkuk government building, where the officials were, this had been taken over by US Army guys. So I sort of turned up and grabbed a soldier and said, you know, take me to your chief. I need to find out who's the boss. And I was taken upstairs to the office that used to belong to the governor of Kirkuk. And there was this colonel sitting there with his feet up on the table. And I went to him and I said, you know, Colonel, slightly embarrassing, but my house has been blown up. And do you have a tent or something I could sleep in on the airfield? Now his response was, you know, we're going to hunt them down and we're going to get those guys. And I was like, Colonel, you know, they're attacking me because I'm a symbol of an illegal occupation. I just need to get a tent. That's all I'm asking for. But I turned up to see him the next day, and I'd got my laptop with me, and I downloaded the 4th Geneva Convention. So I said, you know, Colonel, come and sit next to me.
Which governs the rules of occupation armies and so on.
So I got him to sit next to me, and I read it to him line by line. And I said, if I find you violating any of these articles, I'll take you to The Hague. These were early days. I didn't know against The Hague. They don't recognise the International Criminal Court.
That's true.
So,
How did he react to that?
well, I think he was a little bit taken aback.
Is it worth just saying, I'm sure a lot of people here will know quite a lot about Iraq, but is it worth saying a little bit about Kirkuk, where you began, and its complexities and the way in which it's a sort of almost a microcosm, isn't it, of some of the problems of Iraq, overlapping claims, Arabs, Kurds, oil and all that. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit?
So Kirkuk is north of Baghdad. It's a province which is highly contested. It's got a lot of oil. And under Saddam, under the Ba'ath regime, what he had done was he had deported Kurds and also Turkmen from the province, and he had imported Arabs, mainly Shia Arabs from the south, to Arabize it in order to keep it within Iraq, because the Kurds wanted to annex Kirkuk so they could move towards independence. So it was a very multi-ethnic, multicultural place. You've got Arabs, Sunni and Shia, Turkmen, Sunni and Shia, Kurds, Yazidis, lots of different Christians, Shabak, all these different sorts of people. And in the aftermath of 2003, competing for power. And the Kurds thought, this is our opportunity to annex Kirkuk. So they were bringing lots and lots of people back and trying to push out the new Arabs. And the other groups were coming together to oppose what they saw as Kurdification of Kirkuk.
So it's quite a tense and conflicted situation that you walked into with very little preparation.
Well, I didn't know anything about Kirkuk. I didn't know anything about it at all. I couldn't even find it on the map before I arrived there. And so suddenly I had to learn very quickly, from talking to all these different groups, I had to learn very quickly all their different concerns, their different perspectives, their fears, their hopes.
I noticed that, I don't know, it was on American, was it the US network, that your call sign or your code name was BB, which I think you said stood for British Babe, which I guess wasn't the greatest to... Well, I don't know whether you liked it or not, but leaving that aside, there's another theme that runs through this, and it's a bit inevitable. Again, those of you who know the history of Iraq will, of course, know the name of the famous British official Gertrude Bell, who was involved in the creation of Iraq, carving it out of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. And quite early on, somebody said, we have our own Miss Bell here. How did you feel about that? Was it a double-edged compliment or just a compliment? What was the meaning of that?
You know, for Iraqis, Gertrude Bell is probably the only name that they remember from the British era. Mm-hmm. And they remember her with fondness. She was seen as somebody who loved Iraq, who spent years in Iraq and never left. She died in Iraq. Her grave is in Iraq. She built the museum, the National Museum of Baghdad. That was her brainchild. So when I first heard people starting to refer to me as Miss Bell, it was sort of tribal guys. And they thought, oh, this is great. This is somebody who'll come and sit and talk to us. And Miss Bell, she liked the tribes. But when I went up to speak to Jalal Talabani, it was like
the big
Kurdish
leader,
guy.
yeah.
He was, they call you Miss Bell. And eventually
that was an Arab Kurdish thing, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So I said, Jalal Talabani, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the British government for creating the state of Iraq and for putting the Kurds in it. She was like, thank you very much.
That's quite a responsibility. There's a theme that runs through your book and in other books where looking at the post-2003 history of Iraq about Brits and Americans. Brits were there from the beginning. They created Iraq back in the day. The Americans were relative newcomers. And there's a sense, anybody who knows the Middle East will have encountered this sense, quite ambiguous sometimes, quite ambivalent about, Brits they do know the Arab world, mixture of sort of admiration but dislike as well at the same time. But there is a sense of deep knowledge and experience against the ignorant, blundering Americans who really don't know this part of the world. Was that something that played out in your experience?
It was. I mean, in a bizarre way, Iraqis have this sort of strange relationship with Britain. They will say, look, despite everything, with roads, left us with institutions. There are things to show from the British time. When the Americans arrived, America was, we are not a colonial power. We are not going to build big buildings and roads. And you can see there isn't much to show today of all that investment from the US. But there's still sort of bridges built by the British that are still in existence in Iraq.
So one of the really fascinating themes throughout your book is you working with the American military. You say, I think, you had no previous experience of working with any military, let alone the mightiest army in the world. And it is, some of the most fascinating parts of the book are about that too, about how you dealt with them. And from a position, as you've described yourself as being sort of, kind of anti-war and certainly no interest in military affairs, throughout the book it's clear that you work with them easily, though obviously not without difficulties at times, and you clearly come to admire them very greatly, and especially General Odierno, who you worked with so closely over several. Tell us about that a little bit, if you would. It's a fascinating part of the story, I think.
So initially, soldiers, I just saw people covered in blood. I thought, I've got to work with these guys. I've got to understand them as they see themselves, their own perceptions. And so I spent a lot of time talking to different soldiers and could hear their stories of why they joined the army, how much they loved being in the army, how the army had given them so many opportunities. Some saw themselves as protectors, not only of America, but protectors of all the poor and marginalized people around the world. They saw themselves as, the sheepdogs looking after the sheep. So their image of themselves was very different from the image I had of them. For some, this was about revenging 9/11. For others, it was about keeping America safe. But as time went on, for many, it became about giving the Iraqi people a better hope for the future. And to see how dedicated these soldiers were was quite extraordinary. They worked so hard. They wanted to do the right thing. Sometimes they didn't know what the right thing was. But my respect for them just went up and up and up. Their dedication was quite extraordinary.
So there was a sense of mission, regardless of the circumstances of the war and the absence of any weapons of mass destruction and all that. They still felt they were doing something important and the right thing.
The soldiers, military doesn't choose to go to wars.
Sure.
Those are decisions made by political masters. They go where they're sent. And so there wasn't that much discussion about why we're here. Is the policy right or wrong? It was, everybody's got their little area, what they're supposed to focus on. And people felt that they're part of something much bigger than themselves.
And yet you could ask many people about the US presence in Iraq, and maybe they'd all be Guardian readers, it's true, but I suspect others as well, and they'd say Abu Ghraib. They'd focus on appalling mistreatment, torture, and so on. Well, that would be an unfair response in the light of your experience with the US military.
Those incidents happened, but those incidents are few and far between. That is not the normal. Most US soldiers, when they heard about that, were mortified. They were terribly ashamed. And that was an aberration. So they didn't see that as representing them. It's not what they say that they're about. It's not what they feel that they're about. It's inevitable that things like that happen in war times. And if you don't have leadership, and if you don't have people held to account, those things happen.
What about, you talk about the question of leadership, and obviously that's very important, but perhaps your book is a fascinating personal account, but of course you're not the first person the war in Iraq. And one theme that comes out over the many books and articles that have been written about it is, in contrast with the military victory, which was a walkover, clearly given the balance of forces, the failure of the political leadership in the US in particular, so this country as well, to come up with a plan for the day after, for the period after, the nation building or whatever, after the overthrow of the tyrant and the defeat of his forces. That remains, doesn't it, a really severe indictment, a justified indictment of the behaviour of the Americans and Britain in particular.
I described how I arrived haphazardly
Sure.
in Kirkuk, and I think that's a clear of the lack of planning. When you look at the whole war, I think it was only from 2007 to 2009 that we had the right strategy, the right leadership, and the right resources. And during that period, during the surge period, you could see things started to go in the right direction. So the violence came down dramatically, and the Iraqis felt that the country was headed in the right direction.
But earlier than that, of course, there were two major decisions. I know you touch on them. I don't think you go into them in too much detail, but there were two major decisions that were to have, as it turned out, a really fateful impact on the way things were to unfold. And one of those, of course, was the disbanding of the Iraqi army, and the second, the linked question, was the de-Baathification. Well, you could talk about that a bit. That would be interesting, because they're often seen, aren't they, as the two key decisions from which flowed really terrible consequences, some of which are still with us to this day. We have former Ba'athist officers who are fighting with Daesh, with ISIS, the Islamic State. So just can you talk a little bit about those and how those seem to you? I think you were there at the time.
So those decisions happened very early on after the invasion.
Under Bremer, I think.
Under Bremer.
Yeah.
But those decisions, he gets blamed for those decisions. Those decisions were ones that were very much supported by the Iraqi opposition, Iraqi exiles, who were the advisors to the coalition. So when you think of the Iraqi army, it was blamed for Saddam, basically. And so what had happened following the uprising in 91 and the putting down of the Shia uprising and the Kurdish uprising, those groups coming back in 2003 said you've got to disband the army. With de-Baathification, it was the same. Bremer thought de-Baathification should just take out the top, but the way it was implemented, it went very, very deep. So where I was in Kirkuk, we had hospitals without doctors, we had schools without teachers. So that had a devastating impact on the society. For Sunnis in particular, they felt de-Baathification was de-Sunnification. That led to the civil war, but 2009, Iraq comes out of the civil war, and the trajectories are positive then.
But wasn't it also a mistake to rely on the advice of those exiles? Ahmed Shalabi, of course, is the most famous of them, but there were others too who recommended things that turned out indeed to be disastrous. That was part of the problem as well, wasn't it?
Yes, because those people have been in exile for a long time, so people didn't know what Iraq was like. And those who came from exile, who tended to be Islamist, or tended to belong to sectarian ethno-nationalist parties, came back with the coalition, and it was them who had the idea of Iraq as Sunni Shia Kurd. Coalition didn't make that up from nothing. That was the image, or that was the ideas put forward by the returning exiles.
So Iraqis themselves, you're saying, were responsible for the way in which post-Saddam Iraq was treated on a sectarian basis?
Some of them, yes, the exiles who came back, that was their view. In opposition, the Iraqi opposition, they had come up with this schema. They saw it in terms of power sharing. What it became, when it was introduced in 2003, was it institutionalized sectarianism right the way down. So instead of building up Iraqi nationalism, everything became about sub-identities.
And that sort of links us to where we are today, doesn't it? Some
argue that. I think Iraq came out of that phase 07 to 09. So I think what we see today is a result of bad decisions made in 2010, because I think Iraq had moved beyond the civil war. But decisions made in 2010, when they had a very good election, and yet the guy who lost the election refused to give up power, stayed in his seat.
Maliki.
And the Americans didn't uphold the right of the winning bloc to have first go at trying to form the new government.
So it's interesting, when you look back, I find it very instructive that you look back and you see different periods actually. Most people, because they know less about it and been less immersed in it, would look at 2003 to the present day and just see the whole thing. But you see things actually getting better at certain periods, decisions being made relatively late in the day that weren't necessarily at all the fault of the Western decision makers in 2003. Iraqis themselves have to take responsibility for some of the things that went wrong.
Yeah, nothing that happened since 2003 was inevitable. Iraq could have had very different... And, you've got to blame the Republicans, you've got to blame the Democrats, you've got to blame the Iraqi elites themselves. There's enough blame to go round. But nothing was preordained. Iraq could be in a very different place today. What we witnessed today, I believe, is due to 2010. So the US didn't uphold the right of the winning bloc to have first go at trying to form the government. the winning bloc was Iraqi with Ayad Alawi. I don't think Alawi would have been able to form the government with himself as prime minister, but it could have led to an agreement between him and Maliki to share power, or it could lead to the selection of a third candidate, like Adel Abdel Mahdi. That didn't happen. The US didn't uphold the election results, and didn't broker the formation of the new government. This allowed a gap for Iran to move in. Iran succeeded in brokering the formation of the government. So Maliki got his second term in Iran. He then moved much closer to the Iranians. And he used his second term to push Sunni politicians out of the political process. He reneged on promises made to the tribal fought against al-Qaeda. He subverted the whole command and control structure of the Iraqi army, took out the people who'd worked closely with us, and put in corrupt people who were close to him. And this led to widespread protests, which created the space for the Islamic State.
Well, before we get to that, it's my fault because I'm slightly getting ahead of myself. I just wanted to ask you, if you look back, you were there, I think, for about 50 months. And I read one of the summaries. Altogether, 50 months in Iraq, does that sound right? Somebody added it all up. In, I think, 3 different periods, is that right?
Yeah.
When you look back over that time, over quite a time span, it must have been it was clearly a powerful, life-changing experience, as you make clear in the book. But what sticks in the mind if you were to think of, something awful that happened, or something terrible that happened, or somebody you met who you thought was extraordinary, and somebody else you met who you thought was loathsome? Curious about, any human being in a situation of drama and challenge and discovery like that. What were the highs and lows? Who were the people who stick in the mind, as it were?
Well, some of those people are seated here this evening, so I can talk to those. General Nasir Abadi, who is an Iraqi fighter pilot. His grandfather was Prime Minister of Iraq, had 3 daughters, married one to a Sunni, one to a Shia, one to a Turkoman. For me, he is Iraqi. Every Thursday night, I used to go to General Nasir's for alcohol. As a good Iraqi, he drinks a fair amount. And his home was this wonderful sanctuary in the Green Zone. It's a wonderful place. He's got his friends Farouk, we've got Salma, all of them sitting here.
So the Green Zone comes to Paddington.
They represent to me Iraqiness. They are all mixed ethnicities, they are all mixed everything. They are Iraqi. And his household was that. So we used to bring together all of these different people, the real, the fantastic people of Iraq. So my social life was very much around General Nasir. Sitting in the back somewhere, lurking, is General Graham Lamb. Who could forget Lambo? And so these characters, when I think about my time in Iraq, I think of the great people that I was with. Whether it was British guys, we've also got Hamish McNinch at the back, another British general, Richard Iron, and Richard Thompson, and Fit Bill, Colonel. And there's another Iraqi at the back. Whoa, it's a Tory MP as well. Who let you in here?
Good. Well, so maybe I hope we'll hear from some of you when we open up the questions in just a minute. Very very nice to have so many of your friends here to take part in this. Just maybe a final word from me, if I may. Though perhaps we'll come back to this also during questions. We fast forward from 2003 to 2015. The Middle East is in a state of extraordinary turmoil. Iraq, of course, up there in the headlines as well, but not only Iraq, Syria next door, Libya is I think to all intents and purposes a failed state. Yemen shows signs of going down the same path. We have an American president who very much came into power wanting not to be George Bush, wanting to get away from the legacy of Iraq. We have an American president who shows signs of wanting to withdraw American power, particularly from the Middle East, pivot to Asia, less dependency on oil and so on. Is that, do you think, is that an inevitable outcome of some of the things that happened in the turbulent years that you described?
I think it is for now. I mean, when you look at Iraq, it's lessons in unintended consequences. The unintended consequences of action and non-action, of Bush imposing democracy, of Obama's detachment. And so I think after the Bush period, it was inevitable that the pendulum would swing 180 degrees. I think with the next president, it will come somewhere back in the middle.
My former Guardian colleague, Nick Hopkins, interviewed you in 2012. I was reading his piece before I came this evening. And he wrote, Sky says it's probably too early to judge whether Iraq can evolve into democracy to become a force for regional stability. But what would you say to that same question now?
I still think it is too early to sense that. I mean, you look at Iraq today and the situation is grim. Islamic State controls a third of the country. The non-state actors, the Shia militias, are stronger than the state. So the situation today is grim. What will Iraq look like in 10 years or 20 years remains to be seen. I think the best hope, if you like, is confederation, Kurdistan, and the rest of Iraq. And the rest of Iraq decentralized as far as possible, down to the provincial level. And so maybe we're in a phase of bloody militias, warlordism, but maybe it will end up with being a decentralized system across that country.
What would Miss Bell, Miss Gertrude Bell, have made of all this? She was responsible for putting Iraq together in its post-First World War form. What would she make of the direction it's going in today?
Well, I think like any observer, it's very sad to see this happening, because I think anybody who spent any time in Iraq will always come back with stories of the wonders of the Iraqi people, the most generous, kind, funny, witty people you're ever going to come across anywhere in the world. And people have lived together in this land, mostly peacefully, for centuries upon centuries. So it's tragic what has happened in the last decade. It's tragic what happened under Saddam. And you just have to look back at Iraqi history. And you look back and you think, this was the place, this was Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden. This was the place where it had the first settled agriculture, the first written law. Baghdad, city of, cultural capital. The Talmud was written in Iraq. You look back at this history and you have to have a hope for the Iraqi people. And you have to hope that a new generation will come along that is inspired by that amazing history.
Thank you very much. So now let's open up the discussion to you, the audience. I think, please, raise a hand, say who you are, ask a question. Please don't make a speech. Okay? That's all I ask. And please, the lady here.
I've been going to Iraq since '97, but the last time I was there, I'm Hadani Ditmars. I'm a journalist from Canada. I wrote a book called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, working on another one on ancient sites. It's a political travelogue. But I had some large gaps in the time I was there, as I told you earlier. Went post-invasion for a visit in sort of October 2003, and then was back in 2010. That was the last trip, and was quite shocked to see what had transpired over those 7 years. My question to you is, there's a lot of blame to go around, but when I was there in 2010 for New Internationalist, I interviewed Ali Alawi here, actually, and he said, you can only blame the Americans until 2006, and after that you have to blame the Iraqis. We didn't get it into so much Negroponte and the Salvador option and all that post-Bremer funding of the Shia militias like the Wolf Brigade. But how true do you think that statement is? Does that still stand, what Ali said? You can only blame the Americans until 2006, and after that you have to blame the Iraqis?
There's enough blame to go round. I mean, I think it's tragic that Iraq hasn't had better leaders post-2003. You don't see statesmen in Iraq. Those politicians who came back, they have taken the wealth of the country for themselves. They have subverted the institutions of state. They have not built and they have not agreed what a new Iraq could look like. And so for the leaders of the country, they, particularly after 2010, they must take a large share of the blame for the state of Iraq today. Better leaders could have taken Iraq to a better place.
Yeah, Karen.
I would like to ask about the group of 3,000 Iranian refugees in exile in Camp Ashraf, the spearhead of a very large Iranian opposition in exile, attacked time and again by proxies of Iran. There's nothing in your book about them. Can you tell me something about why you have not mentioned it?
Mujahideen al-Khalq.
Can I just say one thing? Americans promised them protection and instead handed them to the Iraqi government, which is under the thumb of Iran, and they were attacked many, many times. America left them in the lurch.
Friends of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, so Mujahideen al-Khalq were kept in Camp Ashraf. After 2003, this group was highly unpopular because they were seen to have been supporters of Saddam Hussein. And so that's why they were kept in the camp.
Okay, thanks. Can we have the next question, please? Where, with the mic? We have a mic? We have a missing mic. Okay, patient. Okay, sorry.
Jill Russell from King's
Next,
College London. In 2007, in Fallujah, Al-Qaeda in Iraq went too far in their campaign against local governance and central governance. And in mid-2007, the Fallujans, who had been very restive up to that point, turned against the insurgency and aligned themselves with the army and with the Americans who were fighting against the insurgency in a very pragmatic decision that Al-Qaeda in Iraq is now killing too many of us, and the Americans and the coalition and the central government are the better choice. There's very clearly a pragmatism amongst Iraqis and within the country. And my question is, what do you think is the best way to leverage that, to bring that out, to organize sort of Iraqi resistance to the Islamic State along those lines of this is clearly the worst option than any others being offered?
So 2015 is not 2007. It's very different circumstances. When you look at those tribal guys in Anbar who stood up against Al-Qaeda back then, you have to look at what's happened to them since. So they had trusted in us, the coalition. They had trusted in the Iraqi government. And they feel that the coalition left and Maliki went after them. So many of the awakening leaders are dead, fled, or in jail. After Maliki went after, did all the things he did against Sunni politicians, against these tribal guys, when Islamic State reared its head, some Sunnis looked at the Iranian-backed regime of Maliki and they looked at the Islamic State and they thought Islamic State was the lesser of two evils. Terrible decision, but that's kind of how it happened. When you look at Iraq today, the Iraqi security forces are very weak. So you've got the extreme Shia militias and you've got the extreme Islamic State. There's nobody holding the middle ground. ISIS, the Islamic State, can only truly be defeated when the Sunnis of Iraq turn against it. And they're only going to turn against it when they see ISIS can't win, that there are better alternatives, and they're getting support from the Iraqi government and the US. You can't just go back to the way it was before ISIS. The day after has got to be better. And all we're seeing at the moment is tactical military things. We're not seeing anybody put forward a vision for how Iraq could look in the future that creates a more positive vision. Iraqis don't like living under the Islamic State. Talk to people in, living under there, they don't like it at all. They'd much rather live somewhere that not Daesh.
Actually, can we have Karen here at the front, who's been waiting very patiently? Thank you. We'll come to this guy next.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Karen Jabrowska, author of Iraq, the Ancient Sites in Iraqi Kurdistan, which will be published in August.
Okay.
And I'd like to ask two questions, if I can. What do you think would have happened if in 1991 the West had actually supported the uprising? And my second question is, don't you get the feeling that Iraq is basically finished? Pulled together by the colonialists, it's always been an unhappy marriage, and now it's had its day. The Kurds are basically independent, and the center and the south are a mess.
Iraq, this is land, people have lived in this land from time immemorial. So this land will continue, these people will still continue to live there. So Iraq being cobbled together, every state is an artificial state. What comes next? I don't know. Will the borders stay the same? Kurds obviously want independence. Will the rest of the borders change? I don't know. That remains to be seen. Iraqis will have to sort that out as time goes by. If they get to a very decentralized system, then that's one way that people could kind of stay together. And what was your first question?
What do you think would have happened
in 91
if the West had supported the uprising?
Again, it's difficult to know because the question is, what would come afterwards? For many years, the West hoped that there would be a coup and Saddam would be replaced just by a coup. The fear was if the regime collapses, what would happen? And the fear back then was the state would be very weak, Iran would come in, there'd be civil war. So that was the decision taken in 91 not to go to Baghdad. And you can listen to all those people who were involved in the decision making at the time, why they decided not to go to Baghdad.
The guy at the back here, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant, a former customs intelligence analyst who worked in Yemen a few years ago when that country was starting to deteriorate rapidly. And I did notice that many of the UN development organizations frankly weren't at their best in pre-conflict or indeed conflict areas. They didn't seem to be able to gel to changing plans to reflect issues. My question is how, both in the largely ethnically distinct areas, in the three main areas, but also generally, what is the attitude of the population to Iran? Thank you.
I think the attitude of the population towards Iran, depending on the circumstances. So you think of the Iran-Iraq war. That was a horrible, horrible experience. And that led to much bad feeling that has lingered. But in this summer, when the Islamic State made its big dash across the country, it was Iran that stepped forward to prevent Baghdad from falling. And so people who were distrustful before of Iran has now become more popular because it stood by the Iraqi government and prevented the Islamic State. So the relationship between Iraq and Iran, they're neighbors, and those relations go up and down depending on other circumstances. Iran helped the Kurds for years fight against Saddam. A lot of these exiled politicians spent their time in exile in Iran. So there are relationships there that go back decades.
But can I just interject on Iran and its current influence in Iraq? We hear so much about the role played by the shadowy but very publicity conscious General Qasem Soleimani of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It seems that without his role, particularly galvanizing and supporting the Iraqi Shia militias, then the battle would have been lost. Isn't it a different matter when Iran's support is absolutely indispensable to the survival of the Iraqi state in its current, albeit rather rickety form? That's more than just influence, isn't it?
No, Iran is seen as having saved Baghdad from falling. Qasem is a very effective leader. He has been involved with the Iraq portfolio for decades. He knows all the characters. It was Ayatollah Sistani's plea for Iraqis to help prevent the fall that led to all of these young Shia joining militias, joining the security forces. So that's what mobilized people. And Qasem Soleimani has been there providing military advice. He's been at the front line of all the battles. And he's provided a backbone.
And is that altruistic? Is that in the interest of the Iraqi people, or is it in the interest of furthering the reach of the Islamic Republic? Or both?
Well, Iran is not a status quo power. And Iran has benefited greatly from the weakness of post-2003 Iraq. So it has projected its power. When the US was there, it balanced that. And so with the withdrawal of the US, it has allowed Iran to go further forward. So at one level, Iran is projecting power. At another level, it is protecting Shia groups within Iraq and within Syria.
Good. Thank you. Lady here, please.
Hi, Maggie Fick, formerly with Reuters, sometimes working for the wonderful Ned Parker. I was wondering if you were advising General Allen today and could kind of call the shots of what the call was in the current fight against ISIS. How would you change what they're doing? Would you see a greater presence of U.S. military advisors or a greater role in stabilization efforts or anything else?
Very succinct question from a journalist. Very good.
Well, I mean, General Allen's role is the coalition against ISIS, and then you've got CENTCOM's role, and you've got all these other bits, and there's sort of not exactly clarity over who should be doing what. I think the key role that the US play is the Sunni flipping, is to try once again to persuade Sunnis and to support them in turning against ISIS. So all this larger coalition, the coalition of the awful, all these Gulf states that are kind of partly responsible for funding and supporting ISIS, a lot of that is window dressing. Yes, airstrikes are important for stopping the advance of ISIS, but the only people who can really defeat ISIS are the Sunnis living in Iraq. And so I think the US should put much more attention to try and persuade them and help them to turn against ISIS.
Yeah, there's a guy here with his hand up, please. And then this lady next.
Hi, Arthur Davis, I think you know me. We speak a lot about these neat notions of actors. We've spoken about the Brits doing this, the Americans doing this, the Iraqis. Someone earlier said about, in an interview in 2010, somebody said, okay, so it was the Americans' fault until 2006, and then it was the Iraqis. My question is, when we are dealing with these notions, you yourself have alluded to the fact that there are much more complex internal processes, that individuals with different motivations. So when we're assessing the motivations of the people in post-2003 Iraq, do we look at it as, to what extent do we look at it as colonialist and the colonized, or occupier and the occupied, and to what extent is it good guys and bad guys?
I think we looked at it in terms of good guys and bad guys. And that in itself is problematic, because we excluded the bad guys and that they devoted all their energies to bringing down the new order. And we tried to help the good guys, and they just stole all the money and subverted everything that we were trying to do. So that framing of good guys and bad guys isn't helpful. I think it's much better to frame it in terms of it's a power struggle between lots of different groups for power and resources. And what can we do to try and make sure that that power struggle takes place peacefully rather than violently? I think we could have done much more to mediate between the different groups, to understand that it is all about their politics. Violence is an extension of politics. So we could have done more to create a better balance in Iraq and a better balance in the region.
Lady over here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Laura Kleincroft, U.S. military, retired now. But just a quick question about, first of all, I'm disappointed, frankly, that you're not in Iraq right now. I would suppose that you would be there. That would have been my natural inclination if I had known you were here tonight. But just a question about the Peshmerga, because to me it seems like that's a sort of latent force, at least it has always been in our minds, American minds, and those of us who served. And is there a potential that's there that the Kurds have simply decided not to exercise in light of their own positioning for Kurdistan or Kirkuk in particular? Or is that something that you think will come to bear in greater force as time plays out?
So I didn't see Laura there originally. So Laura is somebody else who served with me in Kirkuk in 2003-04. For the Kurds, at the moment, they are getting more weapons. They've been trying to get them directly, but they're also getting more weapons from Baghdad. So for them, at one level, it's about fighting ISIS and preventing ISIS from to their areas. But it's also provided an opportunity for the Kurds to extend their borders. So now they're controlling a lot of those areas which were formerly we called the disputed territories. Now those are under Kurdish control. The question is, can they maintain that border? At the moment it's sort of 600 miles long with the Islamic State. They don't want to be the force that goes in to Mosul, that goes down, because they know there'll be problems afterwards. So it's a tricky issue because they're the most effective fighting force up there. But they know that the force that liberates Mosul has got to have Arabs in that force.
Gentleman here at the front, please. Can you wait for the mic? Thanks.
As I can read on the that we miss the hopes, and we understand that. Also, we understand.
Can you just say who you are?
I'm Abdurrahman Diab. I'm an Iraqi journalist. Also, we understood very deeply that the American feed us that they had no plan. Some observers say that it was intentional. Do you think that the coalition want the goodness for Iraq after the war?
I think at the beginning, after 2003, initially it was all about weapons of mass destruction. After that, it became much more about building democracy. And the coalition, the leaders would say, we rebuilt Germany, we rebuilt Japan, we're going to do the same for Iraq. But there was no plan. And so people were having to make it up as they went along. And for Iraqis, they would say, you can put a man on the moon. The fact that we don't have electricity, it's a conspiracy not to give us electricity. So trying to persuade and convince Iraqis that we were incompetent, that it wasn't a conspiracy, was very difficult. But believe me, it was incompetence, it wasn't a conspiracy.
You couldn't justify that for the Iraqis on the ground.
No, it's very difficult to believe that. But I think you'll find from people who served in Iraq year after year after year that they cared a lot for Iraq, and they tried very hard, and they gave their lives trying to give Iraq hope for a better future. It's gone wrong, but they were convinced of what they did, and they tried very hard.
The lady at the back, I think, please.
This is from Lebanon now. The Lebanese contingent at the back.
Now we're really in trouble.
Position, Lebanese. So Emma, The Unraveling is a book about Iraq, but it's also a memoir. Can you shed a little bit of light on your personal journey outside the politics and the policy?
It's my personal journey. When I think about, who I was when I went to Iraq, I think back even before that, when I was a student at Oxford. And it was always, should you be a conscientious objector or should you be a moderating influence? When I signed up many years ago to be a human shield, that was about being a conscientious objector. And that's much easier, that's black and white. When I went to Iraq, I thought I got skills, this is about being a moderating influence. But to have influence, you also have to compromise. And so I realized if I'm to influence others, I have to be prepared to be influenced myself. And so my time of working with the military has changed me. I think I've changed some of the military guys that I worked with, except for General Lamb, but he was impossible to, impossible to change. But others may have been influenced slightly. So I still think I'm the same person, the same values, but I've had to compromise in order to get things done. And that's very difficult, and I think that's the challenge for everybody. Do you try and make changes from within the system, knowing that the system will change you, or do you stand outside as an observer, pointing out what's wrong? So,
lady here, please.
Hello, Emma. Lee Thorne and I work at Emma's Literary Agency. I've just been rereading the book. I hadn't read the final draft of the book till recently, so it's really in my mind at the moment. And I'm just wondering, there's several moving passages in the book about your relationship with some of the military people that you work with, in particular General Odierno. And there's a meeting with Barack Obama, which is amusing as well. You're very witty, and he says that he says to Obama, Emma sent me excerpts from your memoir years ago before anyone knew he was interested in presidency, and you joke with him and you say, oh yes, I've been trying to turn him into a liberal, and he just shrugs his shoulders. And I just wondered, were you disappointed by Obama and what he did, withdrawing? Did that disappoint you? Great admiration for him. Did that disappoint you, being left of centre in the way that you are?
yes, it has disappointed me, because I think if Obama had actually paid attention to Iraq, he would have been very interested in the country. It is a fascinating country, a fascinating people. He had campaigned on ending the war, and that was very popular domestically. And so he was focused on his domestic concerns, and he put Vice President Biden in charge of Iraq. Now, Vice President Biden doesn't have the same understanding of different cultures, doesn't, that's to put it politely, kept talking about his Irish and how his Irish grandfather hated the British. I know you people, you all just hate each other, it's just, it's in your blood. I thought, no, here's an opportunity for Iraq to move forward. So I think Obama understands we all have multiple identities, and identities can change. And I think he really understands human beings can change. So I'm disappointed that he didn't pay attention to Iraq because he was focused domestically. For me, it wasn't so much troops there, but it was upholding the political process, brokering between the different groups. And unfortunately, the decision was made by, let's support the incumbent, Iraq needs a sheer strong man, Maliki's our guy, Maliki will give us a follow-on security agreement. And so after all of those years, and I think for anybody who was there particular from 2007 to 2009, and General Nasir, you remember this, things started to go in the right direction. And everybody had hope that Iraq was going in the right direction. And I'm disappointed that Obama didn't pay more attention, because if he'd worked harder at the politics of Iraq, it is all about the politics. If he'd paid attention, worked harder at that, I think Iraq could be in a very, very different place today.
Is General Nasir going to ask a question or say something? I'm curious. You don't have to, of course, but I'd love to hear from you.
Make a comment.
No, she's very right. It's not, after 2009, the politics reflected on the military, and the military we started telling them that this is happening, and they could not, because it was the politicians who were dictating the terms and not the military. They sympathized, but their hands were tied.
And do you see, if I can ask a follow-up question, do you see a way out of the current very, very bad situation, highlighted this week by the fall of Ramadi and so on?
I thought before the Americans started their support, they should have put on do's and don'ts for the Sunnis, for the Kurds, and for the Shias. That did not happen. The same problem is all the same now. So the Sunnis have they don't have leadership, and the Kurds have wants their own country, and the Shias are divided, and there's no leadership that can unite them all and put them forward.
Good, thank you. Okay, the gentleman at the back here, no? Yeah, thank you.
David Page, Small Walls Journal. I'd like to just stand back a while from Iraq for any predictions over the future. We hear many cliches, one about the military. It's good at smashing things up, and occasionally it develops skills in making things well and good. And I'm reminded actually by the picture on the wall, I know it's from an earlier period, Vietnam's changed a lot since that man's photograph was taken at Khe Sanh, if I remember correctly. What can we do if the West decides to intervene in other countries forcibly? What can we learn and train ourselves? Because it seems to me that the military are good at going in and doing the coercive smashing things up, but the civil sector, whether it's the state or NGOs or the UN, are absolutely pathetic at the follow-on, and that's when the problems happen. Personally, as a taxpayer, I am disappointed that we are even considering retaining an intervention capability because of what happened in Iraq, has happened in Libya, and I look at it and go, is it worth his life to send that man back there again?
Big question there about the value of intervention more broadly.
No, it's an important question to ask. And I think when we look at Iraq, it's important that we take the right lessons. So one, that everything that happens, nothing is inevitable. Things can go in different ways. Two, that it is all about their politics. The big lesson for us is to have a national strategy. So whether it's in number 10 or whether it's in Washington, what is the national strategy? What is the political outcome that we are trying to achieve? So how do you use military means to achieve that political outcome? Too often military means is used as an end in itself, and that is where things go terribly, terribly wrong. So you look what's happening today. What is the post-ISIS future? What is the political outcome that we're trying to achieve? And that is where our civilian masters fail the military, but they fail the country as well by not coming up with that bigger strategy. I don't believe there's a mythical cadre of people you can parachute into other people's countries to fix them. I don't believe that exists. And I think we should stop thinking, where were the civilians? We had the military surge, where was the civilian surge? I think that is the wrong way to think about it. The right way is to think about their politics. It is all about their politics. Lots of these countries, it's civil wars. How do we help broker, mediate peace settlements between these different groups? So yes, the military can be helpful in suppressing violence, in pushing different groups to the negotiating table, but not just about killing bad guys. That is proven to not come to some sustainable solution.
No. Later, thanks, because other people need to ask questions first, if you don't mind. The gentleman sitting next to you, please.
Robert Ordman, Alternatives to Violence Project. You paid quite a glowing tribute to the American soldier as an individual earlier on, but I don't think it's controversial to suggest that the coalition conducted quite a brutal military campaign of their own, perhaps at least until General Petraeus came in. Fallujah, for example, and other campaigns. How did you reconcile your human rights sensibilities with that rather shock and awe type of military approach earlier on?
So when I was first there in 2003-04, I was in Kirkuk, and the situation in Kirkuk was not very violent. And so already we were doing lots of stuff with the Kirkukis. I was not there during the most violent times in Iraq. I came back again in 2007 with the surge, when the new religion was counterinsurgency, 324, General Petraeus. So that was very much about changing the mindsets of the military, getting the military back out amongst the population to protect the population from the insurgents. So that was the period that I was really working with the US military
You describe very vividly, as I recall, I think that one of the military command centres, that somebody showing a video of some military action. I know it's something else, and it's basically a military snuff movie. And you say, as I remember, you reprimand them and saying, look, this is like putting out, kind of jihadi videos. And there was a shocked silence. But then I think the order went out to stop doing it. Is that right?
Yes, so this was in our morning meetings, the BUA, and they would show, you'd see little vehicles on the ground, and then you see this sort of feed would come and you see things getting blown up, and everybody would cheer. And I said, look, aren't we supposed to be different from them? That is what they do. And so they stopped putting out those videos. It's changed again recently. You'll now see the US puts out its videos of its drone strikes and things that it's blowing up. It wasn't doing this till a few months ago, but the people complained that the US wasn't doing enough. And so now they're putting stuff out to show that they're doing stuff.
Yes, lady here, please. Okay, sorry, okay, got the mic.
Thanks. Emma, thanks for coming. My name is Brad Turpak. I'm an investor. It seems that you credit 2007 to 2009 as a rather uplifting period, which would also coincide with a gentleman named Donald Rumsfeld leaving. And I'd like you to compare and contrast the styles of Rumsfeld and how much credit we should give to Gates and changing the strategy on the ground, if it should be given, or whether you think it was irrelevant.
When you're on the ground, you don't really have much to do with those big guys back in Washington. So yes, I met Rumsfeld, I met Gates, but on the ground, you're really focused on what you're doing. I mean, President Bush says in his book that he had to get rid of Rumsfeld, that the guy had proven so unpopular, he had to go. I think people look at Secretary Gates as somebody who had very, very sound judgment. When he was with the Republicans, when he was with the Democrats, he's seen as a wise person who had sound judgment. And he didn't come up with all the quotes of unknowables and all of that Rumsfeld had. So definitely Gates was the best Secretary of Defense that I got to see, but only got to see really from being a little person on the ground and seeing those guys way up there.
Yeah, the lady here with the mic, thank you.
Hi, I'm Julia Glover with Reuters. I'm wondering about your interactions on the ground with local and international journalists and how you feel that their role may have changed in the years that you were there.
I know a lot of the international journalists working in Iraq, people like Ned Parker, who've been working there for years. There are many journalists who spent year after year after year out there and really got to know the country very well. Initially, there were issues about people being embedded. When they were embedded, were they just being propaganda tools for the US military, or could they have a more balanced view of the country? So that was a criticism. But in those times, it was often hard for them to get out without the help of the coalition. But I think in the early years, some of the reporting wasn't very good. I think the reporting then improved greatly as people got to know the country better, got to understand, you can be manipulated by your stringer, depending on that stringer's background, and to have, you see sort of newsrooms which have got a variety of Iraqis with them now. So I think the reporting has improved a lot.
Please.
Hi, my name's Jaman Kuba. I'm originally from Iraq, but I spent a few years working in Afghanistan. And one thing that I find really interesting is that 10 years in both countries, you ended up with a corrupt elite that were basically stealing the country's wealth and putting it into their own private bank accounts. So I was wondering on what your comments are on what that says about the coalition's approach in both countries, what the learning points are, and also what that means in terms of trying to sort of tackle corruption now and trying to get people in who are statespeople. Because if there's that level of corruption, no one clean wants to get involved.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point, that kleptocracy that you see develop in both countries, which should make us question our model of whether it's counterinsurgency or nation building. We put in huge amounts of money very quickly when there wasn't the absorption capacity to take that money, when the systems weren't in place either. And dealing with these good guys, bad guys, with that framework, meant that we were making the so-called good guys stronger, despite everything that they were doing, And that was then driving more and more people towards the insurgency. So it was a very problematic approach. If we hadn't made them stronger, then perhaps they would have to reach some compromise with their opposition. And I think when we look to the future, we have to think much more in terms of the politics, much more in terms of getting inclusive peace agreements, not excluding people, and have much longer approach to development. We've got all this experience of international development that we kind of threw out the window when we went to Iraq and Afghanistan. And so all that best practice that had been developed was ignored. So we do need to do these things differently. And now that we have these corrupt elites, it's very difficult to know how to change it. In Afghanistan, people live off the aid money. In Iraq, 95% of the Iraqi budget is from oil. And that's very easy rent, very easy money to come by. And so you don't have that relationship between the people and those in power, because they're not really paying taxes.
Yeah, please, go over here.
My name is Sarhang. I'm a Kurdish journalist. I was wondering that everybody knows that the Kurds want an independent Kurdistan, and also in other parts of the region. Why the US and the UK, for example, are so reluctant to admit that as well, and why whenever I ask a UK politician, for example, what do you think about Kurdistan becoming independent, they always keep sticking to the united Iraq. I was wondering, what do you think about that?
It's difficult. It is very, very difficult, because the old policy has been about a united Iraq. But you can say, look, things are changing now. Where will things go? An independent Kurdistan would have issues with the region. So Iran doesn't want to see an independent Kurdistan. Turkey doesn't want to see it. Syria doesn't want to see it. And so within the region itself, there are fears that the more independent Iraqi Kurdistan goes, the more instability it causes in the neighboring countries. Inside Iraq, the Kurds are also a balancer. And did help create some equilibrium at some stage. And so yes, I much the aspirations of the Kurds for independence. But when you look at what the Kurds have today in Iraqi Kurdistan, they almost have independence in everything but name. So it's close. You've got the flags, you haven't got the passport yet, but you've got the flag.
But is it important, that principle of holding on to the idea of a unitary Iraq? Actually, I mean, it is, you said, it's the state of Western diplomacy, certainly, isn't it? Nobody will openly promote the dismemberment of Gertrude Bell's project. Is that something that should be reconsidered? I mean, we talked about this a little earlier. You know, you say, well, we don't know how things are going to develop in future. Maybe it will become more decentralized. Obviously, the almost independent Kurdistan is a strong element of that possible future, isn't it? Is it something that people should start thinking about? Should we be wedded to those colonial era borders in principle?
Or should we go back in and draw new borders? I mean, it's, that's colonialism again.
Well, presumably Iraqis should do it.
It's up to the Iraqis and it's up to the neighboring countries to change borders. You need to get international recognition. There's a whole process through the United Nations. It's very, very difficult. It's happened recently in the Sudan, and that hasn't gone so well. So it's not easy. It's really not easy. You look somewhere like the European Union and people think, why couldn't we have something more like the European Union in the Middle East? So you have free movement of peoples and goods. So the boundaries themselves are not as important.
We've got time for a few more questions, but we are coming to the end. So please, let's have a forest of hands and some short, sharp questions, please. Gentleman at the back.
I have the microphone though.
Okay. Possession is 9/10 of the law, as they say.
Emma, thank you very much for your book. I worked with you, but you might not remember, from 2003 to 2008 in Iraq, so it's really great and a great achievement. I wanted to ask you whether you had any reflections on Abadi's plans to reform the government now, and whether perhaps there's a sort of trajectory from that. Is there a governance solution to this problem, or is it purely a military solution?
I think Haider Abadi wants to reform the government. I think he wants to help set up Sunni groups to fight against ISIS, what they're calling a National Guard. I think he wants to do all these things. The issue is he doesn't have the capability to do these things. So the non-state is much stronger than the state today. The strongest man in Iraq today is Qasem Soleimani. The strongest Iraqi in Iraq today is Hadi al-Amiri, the leader of the Badr Corps. It is not the prime minister. So he's in a very difficult position with his own Shia base. You've got Maliki hoping he'll fail. You've got some of these Shia militias provoking him and hoping that he'll fail. So he's in a very difficult position. There are no technical solutions, no nice governance technical solutions to this. This is politics. This is really politics. So no, there aren't military solutions to this, but military is an extension of the politics. Extension of the politics. So that politics has got to play out. There's intra-Shia politics. All of that has got to play out. There's no quick solution to this. This is going to go on for quite some time.
There's a passage in your book I remember, it's vivid and horrible, because you talk about when things were very bad, the height of the sectarian killings, you could tell who had been killed because, forgive me if I got it the wrong way round, but you know, some people had their heads cut off and some people had their heads drilled through with a drill. Levels of real horror and barbarity, but of course we've seen that in a sense get even worse with the awful images that ISIS, Daesh has been producing. Can you talk about that a bit? I think that people who don't know Iraq and haven't been there are horrified often, but they're also kind of baffled by how things descend to that level of depravity between people whose characteristics you keep praising. But how do we explain that kind of stuff?
Very hard to explain that. And when you look at the brutal methods that the Islamic State has, how do you explain that? I mean, it's very, very difficult to explain it. I mean, you can think of these regimes in the Middle East. They've been doing these horrible things for decades, but they don't broadcast it. So all the torture, all the things that have been taking place in jail, they don't photograph it, put it on video. So the Islamic State is doing doing this horrible stuff graphically. It is trying to make people very, very fearful. And it's succeeding in making people very, very fearful. But how human beings can do that to each other is, I can't explain that.
But not that different from what went on in the dungeons of Saddam.
Well, you look at Saddam's prisons, you look at Assad's prisons, the torture that's horrific. Look at the horrible things that Shia militias do when they go into places. So it's not unique to any particular group of people. But with the Islamic State, they are publicizing what they do. They're trying to show that they are to be feared, that they are all powerful. So anybody who opposes them, they just come and chop their heads off.
Thanks.
I've got it.
That's another general that I didn't say hello to because I didn't see there.
2007 and 2008, when there was considerable tension in the coalition, the Brits probably lost their will to endure, the Americans were reinforcing, and that bred a different approach in the coalition and caused tension. What was it like being embedded into the American command? What did you see of the US-UK relationship during that time?
So when the Americans took the calculation to surge at the beginning of 2007, the Brits' calculation was Iraq is lost, let's get out, Afghanistan is the better option. So this dynamic was taking place at the political level. From where I sat, the focus at that time was on Baghdad, which is really where the American troops were. Basra wasn't so much an issue at that time. And so I think the Americans on the whole looked at the Brits as, we're grateful that the Brits are here with us as an ally. We wish they were going to stay longer, but that wasn't happening. I remember with, Jock Stirrup, almost said the wrong name then, him. So when he turned up at the, at the beginning of the surge, it was kind of, we're leaving, this is not going to work. When he came back about 9 months later, he was, I take my hat off to the Americans, you have completely changed things around. So I think from where I sat, this was just happening. There wasn't sort of anti-British feeling. There was just sadness that the Brits were going and Americans working out where they're going to put extra forces to compensate for the lack of British forces. But I think there's still great respect between the American military and the British military, what's left of the British military.
Okay, yeah, at the back. Thanks. Mary. Oh, not Mary?
Oh, sorry, Mary Dejevsky. What influence do you think you had on General Odierno, and how might he have behaved differently if you hadn't been there?
I'm supposed to know how to answer that. I mean, the fact that somebody like him, who was very much criticised in his first tour, overly militaristic, the fact that he chose me as his political advisor, probably the most different person to him that he could find in the whole world. We've got nothing in common at all. And I think that says a lot about him. They tell you in all the leadership manuals you must surround yourself with people who are different from you, but people rarely do. They normally have people around them who are sort of like mini clones of them. The fact that he deliberately selected somebody so different, I think says a lot about him. So if it hadn't been me, maybe he would have found somebody else. But he had realized from his first tour the limits of military power. And he said he'd seen me working with the brigade, seen the influence I'd had on that brigade, and he wanted somebody to tell him when he was screwing up, to give different perspectives, and to challenge him. So I think that says a lot about him.
Gentleman in the corner, last question, please.
James Ellery, on the staff of Mr. Bremer. You've rightly given a lot of credit to Gertrude Bell. Her principal contribution to the success of Iraq between 1920 and 1958, the revolution, was to agree with the elders that democracy was not for the Iraqis. Can democracy work in the future?
You think what system of government could work in Iraq? I think at one level Iraqis are sort of anarchists. Very difficult to have a system of government that Iraqis are happy with. I don't believe, democracy can work if the people there want it to work. So at the moment Iraq has elections. It's not a liberal democracy by any stretch of the imagination, it's illiberal. I think the best hope is very much a decentralized system. So you have on a districting basis, so you become the representatives of your community, of your constituency. The current system is, doesn't let that happen. So I think if you decentralize power, change the electoral system so that people represent the areas in which they live, you're getting towards a better system of government. There needs to be peace agreements, there needs to be power sharing. Iraq shows it cannot be ruled by a strong man. That has failed. But Iraq shows that democracy can't be introduced overnight because democracy requires political parties. And Iraq didn't have political parties. It had groups with their militias, but it didn't have what we would recognize as political parties with platforms. But don't give up on Iraq.
Well, that seems a very appropriate point to end. Emma, thank you so much for your insights from your fascinating book. I think that you're going to be signing them over here, and if we could just meanwhile thank our guest in the usual way. Thank you. Very good.